And if we're all sitting comfortably, we'll begin. So, warm welcome to everybody, especially if you are a newcomer to St Edward's or to these Tuesday talks. You're very welcome. We usually have, certainly during term times, but at other times too, we have series of talks on a weekday afternoon, and now on Tuesdays from 5:30 to 6:30 in St Edward's, to which everyone is welcome. And when I'm doing them, I tend to look a little bit about literature and imaginative arts, and particularly think about the nature of imagination, the role of it. I have a passion for making the case for imagination as a truth-bearing faculty, and as complementary to and needing to be restored back in balance with faculties of reason. So it won't surprise you to know that I'm interested in William Blake. And I've often alluded to Blake, and both Fraser and I have done so in sermons. We're fortunate to live in a place that at the Fitzwilliam Museum has a really good Blake collection. So I thought it'd be good to dedicate a month, as it were, here at St Edward's to exploring Blake together. And that's exactly what we're going to do. If you get the current newsletter, the October one, you'll see all the dates for these talks set out. What I said in that, I've called the whole thing William Blake ahead of his time, ahead of ours, question mark. Everybody loves to say that William Blake was ahead of his own time, and when he had a great, when Yeats discovered him and published and republished him, Yeats saw him as a great lost prophet and predecessor, and so saw him anticipating all the things that Yeats wanted to do at the turn of the 20th century. And then, of course, he was rediscovered massively in the 60s, not just by, as it were, hippies and flower children, but by all kinds of people who were trying to borrow a phrase of Blake's, which then became one of the great phrases of the 60s, who were trying to cleanse the doors of perception. And the beat poets picked him up. Allen Ginsberg was a great devotee, and there was a great poetry revival going on in London, partly inspired by Ginsberg. There was a meeting in the Albert Hall in the 60s, one we called the Children of Albion, a Blake phrase, and a whole series of poets and poetry were launched from that. So Blake has had an extraordinary series of connections and revivals, and at each point, those who've discovered Blake and found in him a striking prophet and somebody relevant to their own age have always said he was ahead of his time, by which they meant they thought he was equal to their own, and they wanted to congratulate Blake on agreeing with them, really, which is what we do when we say people are ahead of their time. We say, oh look, they had opinions that we like too. But one of the extraordinary things about Blake, which everybody, and especially the great Blake experts, the Edmonds and Kathleen Rains of this world will say, is that there is still a great deal of Blake that we don't understand. I think we understand more and more. I think we understand more of Blake than anything that his contemporaries did. But I think there's a vast hinterland of Blake that is still kind of opaque to us. And I'd like to suggest that that may be because we should have a bit of humility here, and we ought to think that as well as being ahead of his own time, he may actually still be ahead of ours. He may be saying things which we are not ready to hear yet. And sometimes the most exciting things in Blake are when you feel you're on the glimmering of an understanding and you think, I'm almost getting this, and I need to live a little bit longer, and I need to open my mind and cleanse my vision and raise my consciousness, and I'll get a little bit more of this. There's a tremendous sense for me in Blake of how much he still has to give, how much he still has to say. And in the final session of these, I want to talk about Blake as a prophet, and about what Blake may come to mean to us as we move through both the crises, but also the opportunities and perhaps the new ways of relating to the cosmos and to the inner world that may be coming towards us in the 21st century. We may find Blake has got there ahead of us. So whilst I will say, and I'm going to do that particularly today, a little bit about Blake in his own time, I want to talk also about Blake in ours, and Blake, as it were, looking ahead, looking over what the scientists, the physicists so happily call the event horizon, trying to look beyond that. So what I've said is, I've called it Blake ahead of his time, ahead of ours, question mark. I'm looking at him as poet and prophet and visionary, but I'm trying to look at how Blake can help us face the future. Do come forward. There are seats at the back and seats here if you can risk the gesticulations. Today is an introduction and an overview. Next week, I thought it would be good to get to grips with one text, as it were, and see something whole. So we're going to start with the most well-known and in some ways the most accessible, but still highly challenging text of Blake's, which is the Songs of Innocence and Experience, originally published separately and really quite a number of years apart from one another, but clearly meant now to be read together. They're in conversation with one another at all times, the Songs of Innocence and Experience. So that's the text we're going to look at next week. If you have a chance to look at it, it's all online. Blake would have loved the digital age in some respects, although he would have had severe criticisms of it in others. What he would have liked was the idea that you could get vivid image and word together. He really, as you'll see from what I've got here, and I'll say a word about this display in a minute, he was somebody who wanted, in the manner of the medieval manuscripts, to have image and word in constant conversation with one another and challenging one another. And of course, the web allows you to do that. But in any case, you can read everything by Blake on the web, and you can see a wonderful gallery of images. So if you want to find the Songs of Innocence and Experience, Google will take you there. Though if you're able to get books, there are a whole series of editions of it. This is a particularly treasured copy of mine, which my mother gave me, actually as a present when I first came up here to this university in the late 70s. And it's the Trianon Press, and it's a complete facsimile in the size as it would have been of the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And by a happy chance, and I'm very grateful to Anna who messaged me today and told me about this, I was going to do my best to juggle with a sort of creaky laptop and pass some images in around. And she said, did you know that in David's bookshop they're selling off huge printer's sheets with beautiful printings of Blake images? And the Trianon Press, which was set up specifically in Paris to do beautiful reproductions, facsimiles almost, of Blake books. I don't know if they've gone under or whatever, but for somehow or another, David's next door has acquired these printer-sized sheets, and they've got 3 of them. I just bought all 3, but they have a whole stack of them. They must have been intended for editions of the books that were never printed. And, I bought like all 3 for £15 or something, so it's quite extraordinary. And they've got some smaller ones outside as well. So I've brought these here, but they've got them for a while, so not that I want to do plugs for local businesses, but it seems to me an extraordinary opportunity that they're there. I mean, they're really beautiful, you could frame them. I'll talk about those a little bit, but I hope this sheer vividness of colour, this fluidity of line, this movement between image and written word. He didn't, when he produced his own printed books, he didn't, as it were, use type and movable type and set into the blocks and printed down as a book would have been then. He actually, in handwriting, engraved the poems in a special method that he called relief etching, which he himself invented, and then the outlines, and then he went back and he and his wife Catherine hand-coloured everything. He sold very, very few of these books. They were quite difficult to make. They were slow to make. They were almost like a reinvention of medieval illuminated manuscripts. I think I saw somewhere that Blake may have sold a total, given all his works, of perhaps 200 copies of his poetry in his own day. So if there are any poets or authors here who are troubled by small sales, take hope. Now, of course, there are massive and beautiful critical editions available, and these are many times reproduced. So next week will be the Songs of Innocence and Experience. October the 16th, what might seem, or would seem certainly to some of Blake's fans from the 60s and 70s, almost odd, I'm going to do a session on Blake and Jesus. Now, Blake, as we will see in a minute, was a blazing, flaming, righteously angry and prophetic critic of the church and of the established church in particular. We'll look at just words that spring to mind immediately as his lines for the little chimney sweep. Mother, dear mother, the church is cold, but the alehouse is healthy and pleasant and warm. Besides, I can tell where I am used well. But, of course, his critiques went much, much more deeply than that. You know, the walls of the brothel are built with the bricks of religion, for example. He saw a lot of religiosity and false piety as part of what he called the mind-forged manacles. So it was been fashionable for a while to, as it were, emphasise and quote Blake's strictures against the contemporary abuses of the church and read them as though that was Blake dismissing all religions or Blake particularly dismissing or attacking Christianity. I want to show in the third session, the session on Blake and Jesus, that nothing could be further from the truth, and that Blake is constantly in dialogue with the Bible. He knows the scriptures better almost than anyone else, and they're living for him in an extraordinary way. But he is very drawn to and has some remarkable things to say about the figure of Jesus, although he has a very strong attack on what he sees as the false image of what he calls the creeping Jesus, the false Jesus meek and mild. He sees Jesus as a glorious and resplendent energy and a connection between heaven and earth, and ultimately calls him the divine body, the human imagination. Extraordinary things he has to say about Jesus. So I want to talk about that in the third session. And then in the fourth session, finally, on the 23rd, I'll talk about Blake as prophet. And then the day after that final session, on that Tuesday, the 23rd, I have arranged, and I'll need to get numbers a bit beforehand just to let them know, I have arranged for a special expedition for us as a group to the Fitzwilliam Museum. I'm afraid the only time I could get was during during the daytime, so I don't know, I'm not encouraging anybody to pull a sickie, but the fact is that it's going to be at 2 o'clock, but it's going to be wonderful. So if you can possibly be there, let me know. So that gives you a little bit of the overall shape of what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try, nobly this time, to stop in time for us to have a little bit of feedback. I'm afraid I'm going to have to race on these because this has been moved from a Wednesday to a Tuesday, and Tuesday is a college night for me, and I have to be up at Girton at 7. So I'm going to have to sort of get on my bike, as the saying is, pretty much at 6:30. So let's begin then with this general introduction and overview. So just to place Blake in history, his biographer Peter Ackroyd, I think Ackroyd's biography is very fine and highly readable, points out that actually placing Blake in history is always a difficult thing to do because, you can say he was born in 1757 and he died in 1827, and that's a useful thing to know, so you can see him going right through the second half of the 18th century, that he's born right in the midst of, what sometimes people think of as an Augustan, a neoclassical age, an age of restraint, reason, reasonableness, an age which shrank from enthusiasm, an age which diminished the imagination, an age which was concerned to produce as rational a view of the world as possible. You can say all that stuff, and then you can see how he lives on into the reaction against that, the Romantic era, and some people see him as anticipating the Romantics, others disagree. So you can place him in that historical context, and it's a proper thing to do, except that Blake so constantly speaks of all time and all space at every era being simultaneously present, and simultaneously present to his mind, and potentially simultaneously present to our minds. And Blake is so constantly concerned with the transcendence of time and space, and, as it were, looking at things, as the old theologians would have said, sub specie aeternitatis, that is, it were, from the standpoint of vision and heaven, that sometimes you think he is timeless, that he happened to be moving about upon the surface of the earth between these years, but actually the content of what he had to deliver doesn't seem to have been, as it were, conditioned by the time and place that he was living in quite the same way that other people's were. Although he's alive to it, he's alert to it, he's dealing with contemporary issues, as we'll see in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. He's very strongly campaigning against slavery, he's looking at the lot of children, he's looking for social justice, and so on. But he's also delivering things that just seem to be timeless. So, but let's be biographical for a minute, and we'll say that he was born in 1757 in Broad Street, which is in Soho. It's not called Broad Street anymore, it's called Broadacre or something like that. Anyway, he was the son of a hosier who was a sort of, artisan, probably, better off than the poorest of the poor, and, having his own premises and a real craftsman making stockings and gloves and woolen work, and it would have been a cottage industry where Blake would have, his parents would have been working, and his brothers and sisters while he was growing up. He was eventually apprenticed. They saw his ability to draw and his sense of colour and picture very early on, and he was apprenticed to an engraver, eventually went to the Royal Academy of Art, fell out with both the engraver and the Royal Academy of Art in a pretty major way, and set up as far as he could as an independent engraver and artisan. Lived a very, very precarious life, pretty much on the edge of poverty, and eventually, towards the end of his life, in deep poverty and obscurity. He did literally die penniless, in the sense that he actually spent his last shilling on pencils to keep drawing the fantastic and beautiful illustrations to Dante's Divine Comedy, which he was working on. When he died singing. He laid aside the pencil. Just before he laid aside the pencil, he called in Catherine, his wife, and they'd been married. They had a long, and I think happy marriage, unconventional in its own way. And some people have recently written things to suggest that maybe it was very unconventional, and maybe some of Blake's free love theories were being put into a bit of practice. But it seems to be faithful in its own terms. It was unconventional in the sense that sometimes people calling on the Blakes would find them both completely naked and sort of sitting in their armchairs, in their little, and when asked, they would say that they'd been keeping company with Adam and Eve, and since Adam and Eve weren't dressed, they didn't see why they should be. So you can imagine in sort of late 18th century, some people found that slightly hard to handle. But having said that, it was a very close and intimate relationship. And one of the very last things that Blake did was to call Catherine through with this pencil he spent his last shilling on, and draw her picture, which sadly now lost, the last drawing that he did. And he said, "I'm going to draw you because I see the angel in you already. You've always been my angel," he said, and he drew her as an angel. And then he said, "I'm going to that land which I've always loved and always seen." So he was very... and when she died, some years later, she was perfectly clear that she could see him and that he was calling, so they were, that sense of the veil, as it were, between earth and heaven was almost completely transparent by the end of Blake's life. And some people found that hard to handle, that he would be talking to people that they couldn't see and so on. And of course, the consequence of all of that was that a lot of people simply thought he was mad. And I've got no doubt that had he been born in our era, he would have been categorised and medicalised and probably chemically koshed and pushed into and assumed we would have found some labels for him in order to avoid hearing what he had to say. And that may be the fate even in our own day of some William Blakes amongst us. He was thought to be mad, but interestingly, unlike Christopher Smart, whom I talked about in one of these sessions before, who was thought to be mad, Christopher Smart was confined to Bedlam, Blake never was. And Wordsworth, to give him credit, although he said he'd heard of Blake and he took a look at Blake's poem Jerusalem and could make head nor tail of it, he said, "He is completely mad." But then he said, "But there is something that draws me. I find greater interest in Blake's madness than I do in the sanity of Byron or Scott," which was quite an interesting kind of concession from Wordsworth. The much more significant meeting with one of the otherwise well-known greats, which has been really very little written about, and which I would like to write about with time and leisure about in much more details. There was an astonishing meeting, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a minute, between Blake and Coleridge when Blake was a very old man. And a chap called Tolk, who was a Swedenborgian and who loved Coleridge's works, actually got the two of them together. And we have some notes of the conversation. I think it's particularly significant because at the core of Blake's vision was a restoration of the imagination as absolutely core to understanding what reality is, rather than as a means of escaping from reality. And of course that was absolutely the core of Coleridge's vision. And in fact, later on in Coleridge's life, Coleridge came to relate that very strongly to the Trinity and to think about the Logos and Christus, in some sense the imagination in us. But Blake had got there years before him, almost intuitively, when he spoke of Jesus, the imagination. So he was known about, but not really rated. People thought that he was mad. He died in comparative poverty. In fact, he would have died earlier, probably, and we would not have had the great Dante illustrations, or the Gospel illustrations, or the astonishing etchings and engravings for the Book of Job, had it not been for a little group of visionary artists who had nowhere else to go and who were feeling that the sort of the tyranny of, the tyranny of a kind of entirely this-worldly, very meticulously observed, but in a sense opaque kind of art, where you just draw what you see, and you don't draw anything through it. You know, you draw the window, but you don't draw what you've seen through the window, as it were. That was the way art was going, and there's a little group of people who called themselves the Ancients, borrowing the phrase actually from one place. John Lynn and then Samuel Palmer, about whom I preached from this pulpit. They discovered Blake when he was an old man living in Fountain Court, and they called his little flat in Fountain Court the House of the Interpreter, borrowing a phrase from Bunyan. And they came, and Palmer was poor himself, but just fell in love with Blake and with everything that Blake was doing. And Palmer's whole vision as an artist, which we now appreciate very much, you know, the brilliant pictures like the Magic Apple Tree, which I've taken some of you to see in the Fitzwilliam, you know, would never have been made had these very young men not found this obscure old man dying in Fountain Court. Luckily, Linnell had contacts with richer patrons and managed to get Blake the commissions and give the commissions himself to do the Dante and the Book of Job. And the money from that is what kept Blake and Catherine alive for their last years. So there was a kind of, I think he did get some inkling when he was dying that it wasn't, you know, that in this world people would eventually understand him and would eventually see what he was on about. And he had the sense of seeing that he had actually inspired a younger generation. And then, of course, eventually there was a life of him by a chap called Gilchrist, which inspired interest, and particularly interested the poet Yeats. And Yeats really championed him, and it's really as much as anything through Yeats that Blake came out of obscurity and came to be known more widely. So, that's a little bit of frame. I want to talk about Blake as a visionary. Gilchrist, who's the first source we have, the kind of earliest life of Blake, but other writers since, using Blake's own letters and obviously the poetry and things that were told about him by those who known him, the stories he told about himself, says that he saw visions from very early on. And when I say he saw visions, I mean it's what they call eidetic vision. It's not that he kind of went into a dreamy state and made things up, but that he would sometimes startlingly see something that other people simply couldn't see, but which he could describe in minute detail and draw. And people would say, well, you know, a modern psychological view would be to think about that in terms of delusions, or possibly in terms of, you know, psychosis, and assume that what we're dealing with is a mental projection mistaken for reality. The thing, though, is that Blake himself is clearly so completely sane and sensible in all these other aspects of his life. I mean, he ran a small business, you know, he kept his books and accounts, he functioned perfectly well in society, apart from what people thought was these private eccentricities about clothes and things like that. So, you know, it's a bit difficult to do that. Let me just tell you some of the things that Blake claims he saw, even as a child. I mean, as a very young child, he said he saw the face of God, you know. You know, we're talking about 4 or 5. But when he was a boy, I think probably about 8 or 9, he was walking, you know, they lived in central London, but Blake loved walking and would walk out, and he was walking out towards Peckham, and he saw a tree full of angels. You know, the tree was there, and he could simply see these angels shining in the tree. And there's another really interesting thing, which is a thing that really moved Samuel Palmer, and Samuel Palmer came to Blake, that coming home late in harvest time, the sun was setting, and in fact, some may have said, maybe even the moon was out, that there were the gleaners and the reapers in the harvest field working among the sheaves. And Blake says he saw angels walking beside them through the harvest fields. So he would see things like that. So he had vision in that sense. But he was a visionary in another sense, in that he was constantly looking for the depth or the truth or the meaning behind what you see. He referred to the he was interested he certainly looked at Newton's optics and was pretty familiar with, you know, he was a very intelligent man, and he'd read a lot of the contemporary philosophy of his day in terms of Newton and Locke and Hume, and was familiar with what they said. And what they said was very reductive. They said the mind is a tabula rasa, it's just a blank thing. Light comes in through the eye and then it forms images, and they weren't quite sure how the images work, but they imagined the images coming back, and then we have strings of association and we construct a self out of that. That kind of thinking. And all that system of interaction at a purely physical level, Blake wasn't denying that that kind of thing happened, but he wasn't simply saying that that's not what's really going on. So he called that way of looking, he called it the vegetative eye. And he said, I no more consult my vegetative eye for truth than I have a conversation with a window about what's beyond it. You know, I don't look at, I look through. The window is not going to tell me what is there. I have to look through the window. And everything that comes in as a piece of information processed in my brain through the nerves in the back of my eye, that isn't going to tell me anything at all, any more than the window is going to tell me something. I have to look through and not at, or just with. So he was a visionary in that sense, that he was concerned with looking through. And when towards the end of his life he wrote the notes for his own, some of his own paintings, his note, he wrote a great painting called The Vision of Judgment. And somebody wanted an explanatory note, and he said, what